The knock came at 7:40 in the evening, and I almost didn't answer it because at 79 you learn that most knocks after dark are somebody selling you a new roof or a new god. I put down my tea. I remember the tea. I remember it going cold on the arm of the chair because I never picked it up again that night. I walked to the door in my slippers, and I opened it the way I open everything, halfway, careful. And there was a man standing on my porch in the rain with no umbrella and no hurry. And he looked at me for a long second, the way you look at a photograph of somebody you used to know. And then he said the sentence that took the floor out from under my whole life. He said, "I'm the baby from that trial." I want you to sit with that the way I had to sit with it. Because I have been a judge for 31 years and a retired man for 19 more. And in all that time, nobody has ever said anything to me that I couldn't answer. That's the job. You always have an answer. You have a ruling, a citation, a reason, a gavel. And this man, soaking wet, calm as a Sunday, said 7 words, and I had nothing. Not one word. My mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock, and the rain kept coming down behind him. And somewhere in the back of my chest, a door I had bricked up 40 years ago started to come apart at the mortar. Let me tell you who I was, so you understand what he was standing there holding. My name is Harlan Cross. For most of my life, people called me Judge Cross, and a few of them called me Your Honor. And behind my back, I imagine a good number of them called me worse, because I was not a warm man on the bench, and I never tried to be. I sat in family court in a county I won't name, in a brick building with bad heating and worse lighting, and I decided the kinds of things that don't make the newspaper. Who keeps the child? Who visits and who doesn't? Whose home is fit and whose isn't? People think the big drama is in the criminal courts, the murders, the men in orange. But I'll tell you something, after 60 years around the law, the quietest room in the whole courthouse is the one where a stranger in a robe decides which adult a baby is going to grow up loving. There's no jury in that room. There's no appeal that anybody can afford. There's just you, and a stack of reports, and a mother, and a clock. The trial he was talking about happened in the spring of a year I could give you down to the day, because I have not been able to stop giving it to myself down to the day for 4 decades. The mother's name was Della Mercer. She was 22 years old. She had a baby boy, 4 months old, and she had almost nothing else. I need you to understand how she came into my courtroom, because the whole thing turns on it, and because I got it wrong at the very first look, before she ever opened her mouth. Della Mercer walked into my court in a coat that was 2 sizes too big for her, a man's gray coat, buttoned all the way up even though it was warm out, and she carried that baby against her chest in a way that I decided, in about 4 seconds, was the way a frightened girl carries a child she can't take care of. She had circles under her eyes so dark they looked like bruises. Her hands shook. When the county lawyer asked her a simple question, "Where do you live?" she took too long to answer. And when she did answer, her voice came out cracked and too quiet, and she couldn't seem to look anybody in the eye. And I sat up there in my robe and I read all of that the way I'd trained myself to read it. Unstable, overwhelmed, not able. I had seen 100 girls like her, I told myself. I had seen the coat and the shaking hands and the eyes that wouldn't lift, and I knew what they meant. That was my first mistake, and I dressed it up in 20 years of experience so I wouldn't have to call it what it was, which was a guess. An old man's guess about a young woman he'd known for 4 minutes. The county had a case, of course. There's always a case, or you wouldn't be in the room. A neighbor had called about crying at night. There was a note in a file about a missed appointment at a clinic. There was a photograph of an apartment with dishes in the sink and a mattress on the floor and not much else. And the county lawyer held that photograph up like it was a photograph of a crime scene. And Della's own lawyer, a young man they'd assigned her who, I could tell, had met her that morning, didn't fight very hard, because young assigned lawyers learn early which fights the judge wants to have and which ones he doesn't. He could see which way I was leaning. Everyone in that room could see which way I was leaning. I leaned like a barn in a storm. Here's the part I've never told anybody, and I'm telling you now because a wet man on my porch made it impossible to keep swallowing. Della Mercer tried to tell me something that day. She tried 3 times. Once she stood up out of turn, and I told her to sit down and let her lawyer speak. Once she started to say, "Your Honor, the coat, I have to explain about the coat." And the county lawyer objected that it wasn't relevant, and I agreed because what could a coat possibly have to do with fitness? And the 3rd time, right at the end, When I had already made up my mind and everybody in the room knew it, she looked straight up at me, straight at my face, and she said, "You don't know what you're doing to him. You don't know anything about us. You looked at me for 1 minute and you decided." And I did the thing that a man in a robe can do that nobody else in the world can do. I told her she was out of order, and I had the bailiff walk her back to her seat, and I signed the paper. I gave that 4-month-old boy to the county that afternoon. Temporary, the order said. Pending review. But I knew, and Della knew, and even that tired young lawyer knew, that temporary is the softest lie the law tells. The boy went into the system that day, and Della Mercer's name went out of my mind by the following Tuesday, because there was another Monday coming, and another coat, and another girl with shaking hands, and a judge cannot afford to remember them, or he stops being able to do the job at all. That's what I told myself. That's the story I lived inside for 40 years. It's a good story. It let me sleep. It let me retire with a plaque and a dinner and a speech where a younger man called me a pillar. And then the pillar opened his own front door on a rainy Tuesday, and a stranger said, "I'm the baby from that trial." And the whole thing came down. I finally got a word out. I said, "You'd better come in." He wiped his shoes on the mat. That's the thing I keep coming back to, of all things. A man walks up to the house of the judge who took him from his mother, and he wipes his shoes on the mat before he comes in, because he was raised, by somebody, to be polite. He was a big man, mid-40s, with a working man's hands and a calm face and gray coming in at the temples. And he sat down in my living room across from my cold cup of tea like a man who had rehearsed this 1,000 times and had decided, somewhere on the drive over, not to raise his voice. "My name is Daniel," he said. "The people who adopted me called me Daniel, but I wasn't born Daniel. I was born Samuel Mercer. And I've spent the last 2 years finding out exactly what happened in your courtroom on the day you decided who I'd be." I asked him how he found me. It was a coward's question, and he knew it, but he answered it anyway. "Court records are sealed," he said, "but people aren't. I found the bailiff first. He's 91, and he lives in a home 2 towns over, and he remembered my mother because he said she was the only one who ever tried to talk directly to the judge. He remembered the coat. He remembered you telling her she was out of order. He remembered all of it, actually. Turns out the people at the bottom of your courtroom remember everything. It's the man at the top who gets to forget. I didn't defend myself. I want you to know that, at least. I have spent my life defending positions, and I sat in my own chair in my own house, and I did not say one word to defend myself, because there was something in the way he said it that told me he had the truth on his side, and I had only the story. "Do you want to know about the coat?" he asked me. And God help me, I said yes, because 40 years too late, I finally wanted to hear the thing I had ruled irrelevant. "My mother," Daniel said, "was wearing my father's coat. My father was named Thomas Mercer, and he had died 11 weeks before that hearing. Killed at the rail yard where he worked. A coupling failed. He was 31. She wore his coat because it was the only thing of his she had left, and because she'd stopped being able to be warm since the day the men came to the door to tell her. The shaking hands you saw, that was grief. And the circles under her eyes, that was a woman who was up every night with a newborn and no husband and no sleep and no money. And the reason she took too long to answer where she lived was that they'd been evicted the week before, and she was too ashamed to say it out loud in a room full of strangers, and she was staying on a friend's floor, which is the mattress in the photograph your county lawyer waved around like it was proof of something. That wasn't neglect. That was a 22-year-old widow holding on with her fingernails, and she walked into your court 11 weeks after burying her husband, and you looked at her for 4 minutes, and you called her unfit. I have been in rooms where terrible things were said. I have heard confessions and accusations, and the worst that people do to each other laid out flat on a table. I had never in my life heard anything land on me the way those words landed. Every single thing I had read as weakness had been grief. Every symptom I had diagnosed as unfitness had been a mark that love leaves on a body when it's been torn in half. The coat wasn't irrelevant. The coat was the whole case. And I had gavelled it away because a nervous county lawyer told me it didn't matter, and because I was in a hurry, and because I already knew. I already knew. I always already knew. "Where is she?" I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. "Where is your mother now?" And Daniel looked at me for a long time, and I watched him decide whether I had earned the answer. And I hadn't. but he gave it to me anyway. She's in a hospice about 90 miles from here, he said. She has weeks, maybe less. That's why I'm here now and not a year ago and not never. I found her 8 months ago. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I found my mother 8 months ago and she's dying, and I got 40 years stolen off the front of that, and I got 8 months given back at the very end of it, and I drove 3 hours in the rain to sit in your living room because there is one thing she wants, and it isn't money, and it isn't your prison, and it's the only thing I can't get her myself. I asked what it was. I already half knew. She wants to know that you know, he said. That's all. She has spent 40 years being told by everyone, by the county, by the paperwork, by the whole machine, that she was an unfit mother who lost her child because she deserved to. She half believes it herself now. 40 years of a stranger's 4-minute verdict, and it got into her like a poison, and she's going to die believing she was a bad mother, unless somebody with the authority you had that day looks her in the eye and tells her the truth. You took him, Your Honor. Only you can give her back the one thing that's left, which is the truth about who she was. Now I have to tell you about the 8 months, because Daniel told me about them that night, and they are the reason I could not simply say no and close the door and go back to my cold tea and my good story. Because I had assumed, for 40 years, in the small print of my conscience where I did my accounting late at night, that the boy had been fine. That's the lie the system tells you so you can keep signing papers. The child goes to a better place. The child is rescued. That's what temporary and pending review are for. They are anesthetic. They let the man with the pen believe the child floated gently down into a soft green field. Daniel did not float down into a soft green field. He told me, without drama, because he'd made his peace with the facts, even if I never would, that he went through 4 foster homes before he was 6. That one of them was the kind you read about and then wish you hadn't. That he aged into a group facility at 12 and aged out of the whole system at 18, with a garbage bag of clothes and the name Daniel that he'd been assigned like a case number. That the people who finally adopted him, the good ones, the ones who taught him to wipe his shoes, didn't come along until he was 9. And by then, a lot of the concrete had already set. He built a life anyway. He became a machinist, a good one. He married, he had 2 daughters, he kept his temper and he kept his job and he kept himself upright the way some people do, out of sheer, stubborn refusal to become what was done to them. And the whole time, there was a hole in him, shaped exactly like a woman he couldn't remember. A woman he'd been told, in his file, had given him up. Given him up. That was the language in the record. As if she'd handed him over. As if she hadn't stood up 3 times in my courtroom and told me I didn't know what I was doing. Do you know what she was doing? Daniel said. The whole time I was in those homes, she was looking. She wrote letters to the county for 11 years. I've read them. They're in a box in her room at the hospice. 11 years of letters asking where her son was, asking for a review, asking for a visit, and every single one came back with a form. She didn't have money for a real lawyer. She didn't have anybody. She had a dead husband's coat and a form that came back in the mail. And after 11 years, she stopped writing, not because she stopped wanting me, but because a social worker finally wrote her a kind letter, an honest one, that said the boy has been placed in a permanent situation, and the most loving thing you can do now is let him have peace. And my mother, because she was the exact opposite of everything you decided she was, because she loved me more than she loved her own broken heart, she stopped. She let me go so I could have peace. And I didn't have peace. I had 4 foster homes. But she didn't know that. She spent 30 years thinking she'd done the loving thing by disappearing, when the truth is, she was the fittest mother who ever walked into your courtroom, and you were the one who was unfit to judge her. I want to be honest about what I did next, because if I clean it up, then this whole thing is worthless, and Daniel didn't drive 3 hours for me to clean anything up. I cried. A 79-year-old man who put 1,000 children into the machine of the state without shedding a tear, who prided himself on it, who thought the tears were unprofessional, sat in his own living room and cried in front of the son of the woman he'd ruined. And it wasn't a clean, redemptive movie kind of crying. It was ugly, and it came up out of somewhere old, and it hurt coming out. And Daniel didn't comfort me, and he shouldn't have, and he didn't. He just let me do it. He waited. And when I was done, he said one more thing that I will hear on the day I die. He said, I didn't come here to punish you. I want you to understand that. I looked into it. There's nothing legal to do. Everybody's dead or retired, the records are sealed, and even if they weren't, what's the charge? Being wrong? Being in a hurry? They don't lock men up for that. They give them plaques. I'm not here for justice. I gave up on justice around the third foster home. I'm here because my mother is dying and she asked me to find the judge. And I found the judge. And now I'm asking the judge to get in his car. That was it. That was the whole ask. Get in the car. Drive 90 miles. Sit down in front of a dying woman and give her, 40 years late, the one thing I'd taken from her in 4 minutes. You would think that would be easy. You would think a man who'd just cried like that would grab his coat and his keys. But I want to tell you the truth about the hours that came after, because there was a war inside me that night, and I nearly lost it. And I nearly lost it on the side of cowardice. And you deserve to know that a man can weep with genuine remorse and still, 20 minutes later, start looking for the exit. Because here's what my mind started doing. Once the crying stopped, it started building the story again. It started saying, Harlan, you were following the standards of the time. It started saying, the county brought the case. You only ruled on what was in front of you. It starts saying, if you go to that hospice and you say the words out loud, you can never take them back. And everything you were, the plaque, the dinner, the pillar, all of it becomes the story of the man who got it wrong. My whole life, 40 years of a spotless reputation, and my mind offered it to me one more time as a reason to stay home. As if my reputation were more fragile than a dying woman's soul. As if I hadn't already lost the right to protect it the moment I signed that order. Before he left, Daniel did one more thing. And I think he did it on purpose, the way a good lawyer saves one exhibit for the end. He reached into his jacket and took out a folded piece of paper in a plastic sleeve, soft with age, and he set it on the table in front of me, next to the address and the cold tea. He said it was a copy of one of the letters, one of the 11 years of letters, and he said I didn't have to read it, but he thought I should. And then he sat back down and waited while I put on my glasses, with hands that had started to shake like a young widow's. It was dated about 4 years after the hearing. The handwriting was careful, the way people wrote when they only had one sheet of paper and couldn't afford to waste it. She wasn't angry in it. That was the thing that undid me. There was no rage in it anywhere. She wrote to the county the way you'd write to a king, all please and thank you, and I understand you are very busy, and she asked, in the plainest words, whether her son was healthy, whether he was happy, whether he had enough to eat, and whether there was any form she could fill out, any class she could take, any amount of money she could somehow find that would let her see him one time, just one time, so he would know his mother had never stopped. She wrote that she had gotten steadier now. She wrote that she had a job at a laundry and a room of her own with a window. She wrote near the bottom one line that I have not been able to get out of my head since, a line that a woman wrote into a void that answered her with a form. She wrote, I am not the person the judge saw that day. I was never that person. I only need someone to let me prove it. She spent 11 years trying to prove she was fit to a machine that had already filed her under unfit and thrown away the key, and the machine had my signature on it. My signature was the thing she was writing against, and she never even knew my name. I folded the letter back up along its soft old creases, and I put it down and I couldn't speak. And Daniel let the silence sit there as long as it needed to, which was a long time. Daniel must have seen it on my face, the old animal looking for the exit, because he stood up. He said he'd said what he came to say. He put a piece of paper on my coffee table next to the cold tea. He said it was the address of the hospice and his phone number, and that visiting hours ended at 8 and started at 9 in the morning, and that he wasn't going to beg me, because a man shouldn't have to beg for another man to do the one decent thing left available to him. And then he said, thank you for hearing him out. Thank you, to me. And he wiped his feet again on the way out, even though he was leaving. That's just how he was made. And he walked back into the rain to his truck. And I stood in my doorway and watched his taillights go. And I closed the door, and I sat back down in my chair. And I picked up the cold tea finally, and I held it. And I did not go to bed. I want to tell you about that night in the chair, because that's where the story actually happens. Not on the porch. Not in the courtroom 40 years ago. Right there, in the dark, an old man and a cold cup and a piece of paper with an address on it, deciding, for maybe the first honest time in his life, what he actually was. I thought about Della Mercer's face when she looked up at me and said, you looked at me for 1 minute, and you decided. I had carried that sentence for 40 years without letting myself hear it, and now I couldn't stop hearing it. And I realized that the reason it had lodged in me so deep was that even at the time, even in the moment, some small, clean part of me had known she was right. That's the thing about doing the wrong thing quickly. You always know. There's a version of you, a quiet one, standing off to the side, watching you do it. And that version never forgets. Even when the loud, busy, robed version signs the paper and moves on to Monday. The quiet one keeps the receipt. The quiet one had been keeping this receipt for 4 decades and had finally, on a rainy Tuesday, handed it to me and said, "Now. Now you look." Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I stopped defending Harlan Cross. I just stopped. It was like setting down something I'd been carrying so long, I'd forgotten it had weight. And the second I set it down, the reasons all looked so small. The standards of the time. The county brought the case. My reputation. I laid them out and looked at them in the dark, and they were nothing. They were tissue paper. They were the excuses of a man who had used the power of the state to break a family and then hidden behind procedure for 40 years, so he'd never have to feel it. And on the other side of the scale, there was one thing, and it weighed more than my whole life. A woman was going to die in a matter of weeks, 90 miles away, believing she was a bad mother because of 4 minutes I'd spent not listening to her. And I was the only person left on earth who could take that offer before she went. I was in the car by 5 in the morning. I didn't wait for 9 o'clock visiting hours. I didn't call Daniel. I put on a clean shirt, the good gray one, and I drove 90 miles in the last of the dark with a piece of paper on the passenger seat, and I watched the sun come up over a landscape I'd never driven through in my life. And I thought about how a man can live 79 years and never once drive toward the thing he's most afraid of, until suddenly it's the only direction left. The hospice was a low brick building with good landscaping, the kind of place that cost money Della Mercer never had. And I found out later that Daniel was paying for it out of a machinist's salary, that he'd found his mother 8 months ago, and immediately started spending every dollar he had, making the end of her life soft, the way the beginning of his had not been. I sat in the parking lot until 9. I was a coward for that last hour, sitting in a warm car in a cold morning, but at least I was a coward who'd already driven 90 miles. And there's a difference between the coward at the start and the coward at the finish line. At 9 o'clock, I went in and I gave the woman at the desk my name, and I said I was there to see Della Mercer, and she asked if I was family. And I stood there and I thought about it and I said, no, I'm the judge. They let me in anyway. Daniel had told them I might come. Della Mercer was 62 years old, and she looked much older and much younger at the same time, the way the dying do, the body gone to paper but the eyes gone back to being a girl's. She was propped up in the bed by the window, and there was a box on the table beside her, an old shoebox, and I knew, without being told, that it held 11 years of letters that all came back with a form. She looked at me when I came in, and here's the thing that nearly finished me. She didn't know who I was. 40 years, and I'd carried her face like a wound, and she looked at an old man in a gray shirt in her doorway and saw a stranger, because to her, I had never been a face. I had been a robe and a voice and a gavel and a verdict, and the man wasn't in the room that day. Only the power was. So she looked at me kindly, the way a dying person looks at anyone who bothers to visit, and she said, "Are you one of Daniel's friends?" And I had to tell her. I sat down in the chair beside her bed. I asked if I could sit, and she said, "Of course." And I sat, and I put my old hands together in my lap, and I said, "Mrs. Mercer, my name is Harlan Cross. 40 years ago, I was the judge in the courtroom the day the county took Samuel from you. I was the man who signed the order. I watched it move through her. I watched the kindness go and something older come up behind it, and her hand moved on the blanket, and for a second I thought she might scream or ring for the nurse or tell me to get out, and she had every right to all of it. But she didn't do any of those things. She just looked at me, and her eyes filled, and she said, very quietly, in a voice with almost nothing left in it, "You told me I was out of order." "I did," I said. "I tried to tell you about the coat," she said. "I know," I said. "Daniel told me about the coat. I know about Thomas. I know about the rail yard and the eviction and the letters. I know all of it now. I came here to tell you what I should have been able to see in that courtroom, and I'm going to say it plainly, because you've waited 40 years for somebody to say it, and I'm not going to make you wait through one more speech. And I leaned forward and I made myself hold her eyes because I'd refused to hold them once and it had cost her everything. And I said, "You are not an unfit mother. You are a good mother. You are a grieving young widow doing an impossible thing alone, and you loved that baby. And every single thing I saw as a reason to take him was actually the proof of how hard you were fighting to keep him. I was wrong. Not the county, not the Times, me. I looked at you for 4 minutes and I decided your whole life, and I was wrong. And you have spent 40 years paying for a mistake that was mine and never yours. You did nothing to deserve losing him. Nothing. Do you hear me? There was never anything wrong with you as his mother. The wrong thing in that room that day was me." I have replayed the next part more times than I can count, and I still can't describe her face in a way that does it justice. So I'll just tell you what happened. She started to cry, but it wasn't grief, or it wasn't only grief. It was the sound a person makes when they set down something they've been carrying for 40 years. The same sound I imagine I'd made in my living room the night before. And I understood then that we'd been carrying the same stone from two different ends. She cried, and she reached out her hand, that light paper hand, and I took it, the hand I should have listened to. And she held on hard, harder than I thought she had strength for. And she said, "I thought it was me. All this time, I thought I did something. I thought I wasn't enough." "You were more than enough," I said. "You were everything." He turned out to be a good man, Della, a really good man. And he came and found you. And part of that is you. That's the part they couldn't take. That was always yours. Daniel came in around then. He'd been standing in the hall giving us the room, and he came in and he saw his mother holding the judge's hand and crying the good kind of crying, and I watched something ease in his shoulders that I don't think had eased since he was 4 months old. He sat down on the other side of the bed, and for a little while nobody said anything, and it was the most peace I have ever felt in a room, and I had no right to any of it. And I took it anyway, because sometimes grace lands on you sideways, and the only sin left would be to refuse it. Della Mercer died 9 days later. Daniel called to tell me. He said she'd been different in those 9 days, lighter, that she'd talked about Samuel as a baby instead of as a wound, that she'd told the nurses stories about Thomas and the coat and the little apartment. Good stories, that the last week of her life had been, against every odd, a happy one. He said she asked about me twice. He said, near the end, she told him to tell the judge thank you. I don't want you to hear that and think, this is a story about how a bad thing got fixed. It didn't get fixed. Nothing got fixed. Daniel still lost 40 years. He still went through those homes. Della still died in a rented bed instead of surrounded by grandchildren she should have had for decades. I can't give any of that back, and neither can God, and neither can the law, and the law was the one that did it. All that got mended was the one small thing that could still be mended in the time we had left, which was a dying woman's belief about who she'd been. That's not justice. Justice was 40 years too late, and it left the building without paying. This was just the truth, delivered by the one man who owed it, in the last window when it could still do any good. But I'll tell you what it changed, and it's the reason I'm telling you all of this instead of taking it to my grave the way I planned. I go back to that courtroom in my mind now, the way you'd go back to a crime scene, and I don't see Della Mercer anymore. I see all of them. I see 40 years of coats and shaking hands and eyes that wouldn't lift. And I understand now that I never once knew what any of them meant. Not once. I thought experience had taught me to read people, and what it had actually taught me was to read them fast. And fast and true are not the same thing. They were never the same thing, and the whole machine I served ran on pretending they were. Every one of those quiet family courtrooms in this country, right now, tonight, has a robe in it, and a clock on the wall, and a person underneath the robe who is tired and busy and certain. And certainty in a hurry is the most dangerous thing I know of. More dangerous than malice, because malice at least knows it's doing harm. I never knew. I thought I was doing good. I had a plaque. So if you take one thing from an old man who got the biggest decision of 100 lives wrong, take this. When someone in front of you is falling apart, when their hands are shaking and they can't find their words and they can't meet your eyes, and everything about them reads like weakness or failure or unfitness, slow down. Do not decide them in 4 minutes. Ask about the coat. There is always a coat. There is always a thing you can't see from where you're sitting. A dead husband, a lost home, a grief so heavy the body can't hold it up straight. And if you decide before you ask, you will call the deepest love you've ever seen by the ugliest name you know. And you will sign it. And you will move on to Monday. And 40 years later, it will knock on your door in the rain and ask you why. Daniel and I still talk. That's the part I didn't expect. He had no reason to keep me in his life, none. I was the villain of his origin. I was the 4 minutes that cost him a mother. But he calls sometimes. His daughters call me their grandfather's friend, which is more than I deserve and exactly what he decided to make me, on purpose, because he is a better man than I ever was on my best day on the bench. He told me once that forgiving me wasn't about me at all. He said carrying it was too heavy and he had daughters to lift instead, so he set it down. And if setting it down happened to let me sleep at night, well, that was my business and not his. He didn't do it for me. Nothing good in this story happened for me. But some of it happened near me, and it let me become, in the last chapter of a long and mistaken life, a slightly less certain man. And I've come to believe that a less certain man is a safer man to give any power to at all. I kept the cold cup of tea. It sounds foolish. I washed it and I put it on the shelf in my study where I can see it from my chair, and it reminds me every single day of the exact moment I heard the knock and almost didn't answer. And I think about all the men across all the years who did almost the same thing and did not answer, who never got the knock, whose Dellas died alone in rented beds, still believing they were the ones who failed. I got the knock. I answered it, eventually, at 3 a.m. after nearly running. And I got to be in the room. That's not forgiveness and it's not redemption, and I'm suspicious of both of those words now, the way I used to be suspicious of everything a defendant told me. It's just that a man was given one more chance to tell the truth to somebody who needed it. And this time, 40 years late and soaking wet on my own porch, he took it. She said thank you. Della Mercer, at the end of a life I helped ruin, said thank you to the judge who ruined it, because he finally told her she'd been a good mother. If you want to know what 40 years of being certain gets you, it's that. It's a thank you that should never have needed saying, from a woman who never should have had to wait for it, delivered to a man who will spend the rest of his own short time on earth trying to be worthy of the fact that she said it at all. Answer the door, whatever it is, however late, however much you'd rather not. Somebody out there is standing in the rain holding the truth about who you really are, and the only wrong move left is not to let them in.